He was the kind of man no one dared to cross, the kind whose name carried more weight than his words. Michael Hayes, the millionaire CEO who built an empire out of discipline, precision, and control. In his world, power was everything, and vulnerability was a luxury no one could afford. But life has a way of humbling even the untouchable. When a quiet woman named Evelyn Ross entered his orbit, she didn't challenge him with anger or ambition. She challenged him with stillness, with kindness, with the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. This is not a story about wealth or power. It's a story about what happens when someone dares to look past the armor we build and sees the human being underneath. Because sometimes, the loudest change doesn't come from those who command the room, but from the one person brave enough to stand still in it. Stay with this story. It may just remind you that courage doesn't always roar sometimes. It whispers. In the heart of Seattle, where the skyline met the restless gray of the Pacific Northwest sky, Michael Hayes stood at the center of every conversation and yet belonged to none. His name carried the kind of weight that made rooms quieter when he entered. People spoke his name with a blend of reverence and caution, as if invoking a force they admired but didn't dare to approach. Michael was the man who could turn a dying project into gold, who built empires from glass and steel, who never once flinched when others questioned his methods. He was the man no one dared to cross. That evening, the city gathered beneath the golden chandeliers of the Grand Summit Hotel to celebrate the launch of his newest triumph, the Cascadia Towers. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing the champagne smiles of the powerful. The air was thick with success, with the scent of ambition and imported lilies. Waiters moved through the crowd in perfect rhythm, their trays glimmering under the soft amber light. Every toast, every handshake, every laugh was part of the choreography of wealth. Michael watched it all from behind a glass of whiskey. Neat. He didn't drink much, he didn't need to. The taste was only a ritual, something to fill the silence between conversations he no longer cared to have. Around him, men in tailored suits spoke about expansion, profit margins, and quarterly projections. Women in elegant dresses whispered about his charm, or lack thereof. He nodded politely, answered sparingly, and smiled only when the moment required it. To them, he was success personified, a man who had everything. But power, as he had learned long ago, was a lonely kind of wealth. From the outside, Michael's life gleamed like the towers he built, impeccably designed, unbreakable from afar. But inside, there were hairline fractures that only silence could reveal. The applause that followed him from boardroom to ballroom no longer sounded like validation. It sounded like distance. He had mastered the art of appearing untouchable. Yet, even the strongest glass can reflect back the emptiness of the one who stands before it. As the speeches began, Michael stood near the large window overlooking the city. Below him, Seattle shimmered under a soft drizzle, every streetlight mirrored in the rain-soaked pavement. The sound of polite laughter filled the room behind him, but his gaze remained fixed on the reflection in the glass. A man in a black suit, with silver at his temples and a look that no longer carried wonder. A man who had climbed so high, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen from below. People often said Michael Hayes didn't believe in limits. The truth was, he didn't believe in connection. Somewhere along the way, connection had begun to feel like weakness, something that made you slow, distracted, vulnerable. He built walls, not just in business, but within himself. Every deal he closed was another brick in the fortress of control. Still, there were nights quiet, unguarded moments when he wondered what all this success had cost him, when the city slept and the glow of the skyline was his only companion. He sometimes thought of the boy he once was, the one who wanted to build things that lasted, not just things that impressed. But those thoughts never stayed long. There was always another deal, another signature, another tower to build. At the gala, people approached him with practiced enthusiasm. "Mr. Hayes, it's an honor. Your vision is remarkable. The Cascadia project will change Seattle forever." He replied with a measured smile each time, his words as polished as his cufflinks. "I hope so," he said. "That's the goal. But as the night stretched on, the applause faded into background noise, and the air began to feel heavy. The golden lights that had seemed so grand an hour ago now felt suffocating, casting long shadows across the marble floor. He looked around the room, so many faces, none familiar, so many voices, none speaking anything real. In a corner, a jazz band played something slow and tender, but the melody barely reached him. It reminded him of another life, another version of himself who might have stopped to listen. Now, he only heard the rhythm of obligation, the beat of success that never slowed down. Michael's assistant approached quietly, whispering something about investors waiting to speak with him. He nodded, straightened his tie, and turned back toward the crowd. His movements were graceful, calculated. Every gesture had purpose. Every glance carried weight. To the world, he was composed, always composed. But deep down, beneath the layers of control and confidence, there was an ache he couldn't name. A question that haunted him more than failure ever could. What if no one really knows me anymore? Outside, the drizzle had turned to rain, tapping gently against the windows like fingers trying to get in. The city below pulsed with life, cars moving, people laughing, lights flickering in distant apartments. Somewhere out there, real conversations were happening, real connections. But here, inside this cathedral of success, there was only performance. He raised his glass once more, not in celebration, but in quiet resignation. The whiskey caught the light golden, deceptive, just like the world he'd built. Someone nearby called his name, and he turned, smiling as if nothing inside him had shifted. That was Michael Hayes, polished, distant, untouchable. And yet, if anyone had looked closely, if anyone had cared to see beyond the flawless surface, they might have noticed the faintest crack in the glass, a flicker of something human, something longing to be seen, something waiting, quietly, for the one person who would dare to cross him, not to challenge his power, but to remind him that even the untouchable man was still capable of being touched. The night of the gala drifted toward its elegant conclusion. The laughter had softened, the lights dimmed to a tender gold, and the guests began to move toward the exit, their conversations dissolving into the hum of rain outside. Michael Hayes lingered near the back of the ballroom, his polished shoes glinting under the chandeliers. He wasn't ready to leave yet, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the emptiness that awaited him beyond the glass doors. Perhaps it was the faint echo of something he couldn't name. He was reaching for another glass of water, absent-mindedly, when it happened, a sharp gasp, a jolt, and then the unmistakable warmth of hot coffee spilling across the sleeve of his tailored charcoal suit. The liquid spread in a dark bloom over the fine wool, dripping toward the cuff of his shirt. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Michael turned, instinctively ready for the usual cascade of apologies, those frantic, trembling words people offered when they thought they'd offended him. It was always the same. "I'm so sorry. Mr. Hayes," or "please, let me fix that." They came with wide eyes and shallow breaths, terrified of disappointing a man whose approval could shape careers. But this time, none of that came. Instead, he found himself looking into a pair of calm, steady eyes. The woman standing before him wasn't flustered. She wasn't even embarrassed. She simply held a napkin, handed it to him with quiet composure, and said almost gently, "You'll live." For a moment, Michael wasn't sure he'd heard her right. The corner of her mouth held the faintest hint of a smile, not mocking, not bold, just certain. Then she turned away, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and continued toward the coffee table, her movements unhurried and graceful. Michael stared after her, still clutching the napkin she'd given him. The warmth of the coffee had already cooled against his sleeve, but something else lingered, a spark of something unfamiliar. Not anger, not indignation, something closer to curiosity. He glanced around. The few people who had witnessed the exchange quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't seen. It wasn't every day that someone dismissed the great Michael Hayes with a casual remark. Most people would have stumbled over apologies, desperate to erase even the smallest mistake in his presence. But she hadn't. She had looked right at him, really looked and seemed utterly unmoved by who he was. Her name, he would later learn, was Evelyn Ross. But that night, she was simply the woman who didn't flinch. As the party wound down, Michael found himself scanning the room, searching for her without knowing why. He spotted her once, near the far end of the ballroom, speaking softly with another guest. She was dressed simply, nothing flashy, no sequins or shimmer, just a soft gray dress that matched the mist outside. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and there was something deliberate about her stillness, like a lake untouched by wind. He couldn't recall the last time anyone had made him feel off balance. Power had a way of insulating him from surprise. But this woman, this quiet stranger, had managed to pierce through that invisible armor with nothing more than a sentence and a look that refused to yield. When he finally left the gala, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening. He stepped into his waiting car, the city lights stretching out in blurred reflections across the windshield. As the driver pulled away, Michael stared at his sleeve again. The faint stain remained a small imperfection on an otherwise flawless evening. He should have been irritated, yet, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, the sight made him smile. He thought of her words, "You'll live." 3 small words, simple, direct. But beneath them was something else, something that sounded almost like truth. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him without trying to impress or appease. Most people adjusted their tone in his presence, softened their language, chose their words like offerings. But she hadn't adjusted. She had met him, eye to eye, with the calm certainty of someone who owed him nothing. That, he realized, was power of a different kind. In the days that followed, her face lingered in his thoughts, not vividly, not obsessively more, like the echo of a melody he couldn't quite place. He found himself thinking about how rare it was to encounter someone unshaken by wealth or reputation. The world around him thrived on pretense, on the theater of admiration. Yet that woman Evelyn had walked through it untouched. He tried to imagine what kind of life had shaped that steadiness, what kind of courage it took to look at a man like him and say something so simple, so disarming. Perhaps it wasn't courage at all. Perhaps it was peace. That thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Because for all his achievements, Michael Hayes had never known peace, control, yes, success, absolutely, but peace, that quiet assurance that nothing and no one could disturb your center, was foreign territory. And now, because of one unexpected encounter, he found himself wondering what it would feel like to live like that. The stain on his sleeve eventually faded, replaced by a fresh suit and another long day of meetings. But the moment remained a brief, human interruption in the rhythm of his untouchable life. Somewhere in the city, Evelyn Ross carried on with her day, unaware that she had shifted the balance of a man who had spent years believing himself unshakable. He didn't know her story yet, didn't know that behind her calm eyes lay a history as quiet as it was heavy. But something in her presence had already started to undo him, not through confrontation, but through stillness. And perhaps that was the lesson hidden in their brief collision, that sometimes strength doesn't roar. It simply stands its ground. That night, long after he should have forgotten, Michael caught himself murmuring her words again as he stared out over the rain-soaked city. "You'll live." He smiled to himself, not because it was comforting, but because it was true. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive. And somewhere in the rhythm of that realization, the untouchable man began to crack open, just a little without breaking. Days passed, then weeks. Yet, every now and then, Michael caught himself remembering that moment, the warmth of the spilled coffee, the steadiness in her gaze, the quiet authority behind 3 simple words: "You'll live." It wasn't an obsession, not quite, more like a memory that refused to fade, circling back during silent elevator rides or sleepless nights when the city glowed through his window. He told himself it was nothing, just an odd encounter, a momentary break in the rhythm of his otherwise ordered life. But deep down, Some small, restless part of him knew better. Something in him had shifted, however slightly. The untouchable man had been touched, and though he didn't yet understand how, the impact had begun to ripple. Then, one morning, about a month later, her name appeared again unexpected, uninvited, printed neatly on the agenda for the upcoming City Planning Committee meeting. Lead architect Evelyn Ross, Rainier Hill Park redevelopment. Michael paused when he read it. For a moment, he thought it must be a coincidence. Seattle was full of designers, architects, and consultants. Surely it couldn't be her. But curiosity, that rare emotion he'd spent years suppressing, began to stir again. Rainier Hill Park was a public project his company had recently chosen to sponsor, a symbolic gesture of goodwill meant to soften the image of corporate expansion. For Michael, it had been another calculated move, a way to remind the city that his empire wasn't just about towers and profit margins, but also about community investment. He hadn't paid much attention to the creative side of the project, until now. The morning of the meeting was unusually bright. The air carried that clean, cool scent that follows an autumn rain. Michael arrived at the Seattle Civic Hall early, his presence tall, composed, unmistakable, drawing the usual mixture of admiration and unease. His assistant briefed him as they walked key talking points, public relations angles, budget figures. He nodded, but his mind wasn't fully listening. When the meeting began, the room filled with the soft hum of conversation, the shuffle of papers, and the faint echo of footsteps against polished floors. City officials, journalists, and architects took their seats. Michael sat near the front, his posture precise, his expression neutral. Then the door opened, and she walked in. Evelyn Ross, no mistaking her now. That same calm presence, that quiet grace that drew attention without ever asking for it. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She wore no bold colors, no ornaments, just a simple navy blouse and a focused expression that belonged to someone who had work to do. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, but not surprise. She acknowledged him with a nod so subtle it could have been imagined, then turned her attention to the front of the room. Michael felt a curious tension inside him, not discomfort exactly, but awareness sharp and unexpected. Here she was again, not as a bystander in his world, but as a voice in her own. When the presentations began, Evelyn stood to speak. Her tone was calm, deliberate, but there was quiet conviction beneath it. She spoke of green spaces and air quality, of the importance of creating places where people could breathe and children could play. She described the park not as an asset, but as a living promise, a gift from the city to its people. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Not the kind that came from authority, but the kind that came from truth. Michael listened, arms crossed, studying her more than her slides. Around them, city officials nodded thoughtfully, some even smiling. She wasn't trying to sell anything. She was simply inviting them to imagine something better. When it was his turn to speak, the contrast was stark. Michael's words were sharp, efficient, laced with the vocabulary of finance and opportunity. He talked about return on investment, about potential growth in surrounding districts, about sustainability metrics that please shareholders. His voice was steady, practiced, commanding, and yet, as he spoke, he caught sight of her sitting quietly at the edge of the long table, her gaze lowered, hands folded. She wasn't challenging him, but she didn't seem convinced either. It was as if she were watching two different worlds collide, the world that built and the world that belonged. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt the discomfort of being seen not as powerful, but as part of the problem. When the meeting adjourned, the room filled with chatter. People exchanged cards, shook hands, made promises to follow up. Evelyn packed her materials slowly, methodically. Michael hesitated before approaching her, unsure of what he even wanted to say. "Miss Ross," he said finally, his tone more tentative than he intended. "You did well in there." She looked up at him, those same calm eyes unblinking. "Thank you," she replied. "I wasn't trying to impress anyone." Her answer struck him with quiet precision. He smiled faintly. I suppose that's what makes it impressive. For a moment, something softened between them, a silence that wasn't awkward, but alive. Then she gathered her bag, offered a polite nod, and walked away, leaving the scent of rain and paper behind her. Michael watched her go, a strange mix of admiration and frustration stirring within him. She was different, not in the way people like to brand difference as novelty, but in the way she seemed completely unafraid to exist without permission. As he stepped out into the crisp afternoon, the city felt altered somehow. The glass towers that had always mirrored his success now reflected something else, a question he couldn't quite answer. He represented the empire, the profit, the power. She represented the earth, the quiet, the people, two forces that weren't meant to meet, and yet they had. The truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about her, not because she challenged him openly, but because she didn't need to. Her stillness did what confrontation never could. It revealed the noise within him. As the sun broke briefly through the clouds, its light glinted off the buildings he had built, spreading across the wet pavement like a fleeting reminder that beauty wasn't owned, it was shared. And for the first time in years, Michael Hayes wondered what might happen if he stopped building walls and started building bridges. Because sometimes, the most unexpected returns aren't about people coming back into your life. They're about the parts of yourself you thought were gone, quietly finding their way home. After that meeting at the city hall, something quietly shifted between them, though neither could have named it then. The next week brought an email from the city's development board, confirming what both already knew. Evelyn Ross and Michael Hayes would be working together on the design and execution of Rainier Hill Park. The message was formal, efficient, free of emotion, just as Michael preferred things to be. But when he read her name on the partnership line, his pulse quickened for reasons that had nothing to do with business. Their first official meeting took place on a Tuesday morning, inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking the misty expanse of Elliott Bay. Outside, Seattle was wrapped in drizzle, the kind that blurred the skyline into soft gray watercolor. Inside, the table gleamed under fluorescent light, scattered with blueprints, sketches, and coffee cups. Evelyn arrived a few minutes early. She carried no entourage, no visible shield of self-importance, just a rolled-up set of drawings and that same calm that seemed to move with her wherever she went. She greeted everyone with a polite smile, her voice low and steady. When Michael entered, the conversation in the room seemed to shrink, as it often did. He was used to commanding attention simply by showing up. Yet, as his eyes met Evelyn's, that usual sense of control felt different. She nodded once, no more, before turning her attention back to the plans spread before her. They began discussing the park's layout, the balance between open spaces and tree clusters, pathways, lighting, and the central fountain design. Michael approached it like he did every project: decisive, strategic, goal-oriented. He talked about public visibility, economic benefit, long-term maintenance costs. Evelyn listened, occasionally jotting a note or adjusting a line on the blueprint. She didn't interrupt, she didn't challenge, but when she finally spoke, her words carried a quiet authority that drew everyone's focus. People don't just visit parks to walk, she said softly. They come to remember how to breathe. The room fell still. Even Michael didn't have an immediate response. Her tone wasn't poetic for effect. It was truthful. She spoke about the human need for stillness, for space that didn't demand productivity. Her fingers traced the outline of the proposed garden path. And for a brief second, Michael noticed the gentleness of that gesture, the way she treated design not as control, but as care. He had spent years building towers that reached higher than anyone else's. She, it seemed, wanted to build spaces where people could simply rest. As the meeting went on, Michael found himself listening more and speaking less, a rare occurrence. Evelyn's way of communicating wasn't forceful, yet it had weight. She never fought for the last word, and yet her silence seemed to echo long after she stopped talking. It intrigued him. Over the following weeks, their collaboration deepened. They visited the Rainier Hill site together, an open stretch of uneven land with patches of overgrown grass, surrounded by the soft hum of the city. The air smelled of cedar and wet earth. Michael stood with his hands in his pockets, surveying the area as an investor might, thinking of timelines, projections, and public approval. Beside him, Evelyn crouched down, running her hand along the damp soil. "It's good ground," she murmured. "It remembers." Michael tilted his head. "Remembers what?" She smiled faintly, still studying the earth. "That things can grow again after being cut down." He didn't reply, but her words stayed with him long after they left the site. In the weeks that followed, he began noticing details he'd never paid attention to before: the rhythm of raindrops on his office window, the way morning light spread slowly across architectural plans, the sound of Evelyn's pencil moving across paper, steady and sure. She had a way of filling silence without speaking. It was as if she trusted the quiet to do part of the work. And somewhere between the emails, the meetings, and the long drives through rain-slicked streets, Michael began to understand that her silence wasn't emptiness, it was precision. She used words like an artist used light sparingly, intentionally, to draw attention to what truly mattered. There were moments he wanted to ask her questions not about the project, but about her. He wanted to know what made her so still, so unshaken in a world that thrived on noise. But he never asked. Something about her calm made him afraid to disturb it. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the sound, they stayed late in the design studio. The rain outside had grown heavier, tapping against the large windows like a quiet metronome. Evelyn was sketching adjustments to the fountain structure. Michael stood nearby, watching the play of lamplight across the translucent paper. She didn't look up when she spoke. "Do you ever get tired of it?" He frowned slightly. "Of what, winning?" she said. "Always needing to?" He didn't answer right away. Her question wasn't an accusation, it was an invitation. And in that moment, Michael realized how rare it was for someone to ask him something without expecting a performance. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Sometimes." Evelyn looked at him then, her eyes soft, unjudging. For the first time, he felt truly seen not as a CEO or a public figure, but as a man who'd forgotten what peace felt like. They went back to work, the silence between them now gentler, almost companionable. Outside, the rain kept falling, streaking the glass with silver lines. Inside, under the warm glow of desk lamps, their hands moved over blueprints, hers sketching, his steadying, both contributing to something that was slowly becoming more than just a park. Michael began to realize that this collaboration wasn't only reshaping a piece of land, it was reshaping him. There was something sacred in the way Evelyn moved through the world, quiet but unwavering, kind but strong. She didn't seek attention, yet she commanded it. And in that stillness, Michael found something he hadn't known he was missing. A kind of peace that didn't demand, didn't prove, didn't conquer. As they wrapped up that night, Evelyn rolled up the plans and tucked them under her arm. "Good work today," she said softly. He nodded, watching her walk toward the door, her silhouette framed by the dim light. When the door closed behind her, Michael stood for a moment, listening to the rain. The blueprints lay open on the table, their lines glowing faintly under the lamp. He reached out and traced one of her pencil marks with his finger, a curve so small, yet somehow full of meaning. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the water. Inside, the untouchable man found himself learning a new kind of architecture, one not made of glass or steel, but of silence, trust, and quiet understanding. And though he couldn't yet name it, he knew this design, the one drawn in rainlight and stillness, was already changing the blueprint of his own heart. Autumn deepened across Seattle, painting the city in tones of rust and gold. The days grew shorter, the rain more constant, and the light when it appeared felt softer, like a gift. At the Rainier Hill project site, work continued steadily, but something else was unfolding too, something quieter, more delicate than any blueprint could capture. Between Michael and Evelyn, a kind of unspoken understanding had begun to take shape. What started as professional collaboration slowly evolved into moments that lived outside the bounds of their work, shared coffee during long evenings at the office, quiet drives through misty roads after site visits, a few sentences exchanged that seemed to mean far more than they said. There were no declarations, no promises, just two people learning how to exist in the same silence. One evening, as the city lights blurred behind the rain-streaked windows of the design studio, Evelyn lingered after the team had gone home. She was hunched over the latest draft of the park's layout, adjusting the placement of a walking path near the fountain. Michael watched from across the room, leaning against the window, his tie loosened, his usual edge softened. "You don't have to stay this late," he said quietly. She looked up, offering a small smile. "Neither do you." He wanted to reply, but didn't. Instead, he walked closer, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The only sound was the steady rain, the faint hum of the city outside. After a long pause, Evelyn spoke again, almost absently. "My mother used to love the rain," she said. She said it made her feel less alone, like the world was crying with her. Michael looked at her, unsure if she was talking to him or to herself. "Is she still here?" he asked gently. Evelyn nodded, though her smile faltered. "She's at Silver Pines, a care home just outside the city. Early dementia." Her voice trembled, just for a second. "Some days she remembers me. Some days, I'm just another kind stranger who visits." She traced her finger along the paper, her gaze far away. "Designing this park, it's partly for her. She used to take me to one when I was a kid. Said parks are the only places where time slows down." Michael didn't speak. There was nothing to fix, no solution he could offer. He just listened, realizing how rarely he'd ever done that for anyone. After a moment, Evelyn laughed softly, though it sounded tired. "Sorry. You didn't ask for all that." He shook his head. "Don't apologize. It's good to hear something real for a change." She looked at him then, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "You make it sound like real things are rare for you." He hesitated, then sat down across from her, his elbows resting on the table. "They are—" The words came slowly at first, like a confession slipping past the defenses he'd built over years of being admired but never known. "My father was a hard man. Everything was a test grades, sports, even dinner conversations. If you failed, you earned silence. If you succeeded, you earned distance." Evelyn listened quietly, her eyes steady. "When I was 15, he continued, he told me emotion was a liability, said people who feel too much end up losing everything. I spent the next 30 years proving him right." He exhaled, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "And here I am, successful, respected, and half the time, I can't tell if I'm even alive." Evelyn's expression softened. "You're alive," she said, "just tired." Something in her tone gentle. Certain broke through him more deeply than pity ever could. The rain intensified outside, a rhythmic hush against the glass. Michael turned to look at it, his reflection faint in the window, his face older than he remembered, his eyes weary but somehow lighter. "You ever feel like you've built something so perfect it trapped you inside?" he asked. Evelyn tilted her head, like glass walls. He nodded. "Exactly. Everyone can see you, but no one can touch you." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe the glass isn't the problem. Maybe you just forgot how to open the door." For the first time in years. Michael laughed, a small, genuine sound that startled them both. It was short-lived, but it felt real. The hours slipped by unnoticed. They talked about art, about mistakes, about how success often demanded silence. Evelyn shared stories about her mother, the way she'd hum the same song every morning, the way she'd forget the words but remember the tune. Michael spoke about his failed marriage, about how achievement had replaced affection, and how love, when it came, always felt like something he didn't quite know how to hold. By the time they finally packed up, the city outside had fallen quiet. The streets shimmered under the streetlights, and the rain had softened to a mist. As they walked out together, Michael noticed her small frame beside him, her steps unhurried, her expression peaceful. She didn't fill the silence with chatter. She didn't need to. Somehow, being near her made the silence feel like a companion rather than a burden. At the curb, they paused. "Do you ever get scared?" he asked. "Of what?" "Of letting people in." She looked up at him, rain catching the light in her hair. "All the time," she said, "but I do it anyway. Otherwise, life just becomes a waiting room." He nodded slowly, the truth of it settling in his chest like warmth. When they parted, Michael stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the soft gray of the night. The rain had left a faint reflection of the two of them on the wet pavement, two figures walking different directions, yet somehow bound by the same invisible thread. That night, lying awake in his penthouse, Michael stared at the ceiling and thought about her words, about her mother, about glass walls and doors left unopened, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the untouchable man. He felt like someone seen not by the world, not by his reflection, but by another soul who didn't flinch at what she found. He turned toward the window, where rain streaked softly down the glass, distorting the city lights into wavering lines. There, in the shifting glow, he thought he saw his own reflection beginning to change, not perfect, not whole, but human. The cracks in the glass weren't breaking him anymore. They were letting the light in. The days after that quiet, rainy night felt lighter somehow, like a window had been cracked open in a room long sealed. Michael and Evelyn continued to work side by side, their connection deepening in ways neither dared to name. It wasn't romantic in the obvious sense. There were no confessions, no lingering touches, but there was an unspoken understanding, the kind that grows only in shared silences and honest conversations. To those who watched from the outside, though, subtlety didn't matter. It began with whispers, small, almost innocent observations among the staff. The CEO spending more time at the design office than at headquarters. The architect who seemed unusually calm in his presence. A few exchanged glances, a few half smiles, and soon the quiet hum of curiosity began to spread. By the time the Rainier Hill project entered its public phase, those whispers had become stories, the kind that fill the spaces between truth and imagination, feeding on envy and fascination in equal measure. They called her the woman who caught Michael Hayes' attention. Some said she was using him to rise in her career. Others said she had tamed the untouchable man. Every version grew louder, bolder, less true. For Michael, the noise was familiar. He had lived under scrutiny for years, every move analyzed, every gesture magnified. But for Evelyn, it was different. She had always lived quietly, working behind the scenes, content to let her work speak for her. Now, her name appeared in online articles and gossip columns, wrapped in narratives she didn't write. The first time she saw her picture on a blog, the caption read, "The architect behind the CEO's smile." She closed her laptop and stared out the window for a long time. Outside, the city glistened after rain, but all she could feel was the ache of exposure. Her world, once private and calm, now felt invaded by speculation and half-truths. At the office, things shifted subtly but unmistakably. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Colleagues exchanged cautious smiles. A few tried to offer sympathy with cautious and well-meaning comments. "Don't let it get to you." Or, "People just like to talk," but sympathy felt like pity, and pity was heavier than silence. Michael noticed the change too. The way people looked at him differently. The way meetings grew tenser, the air thick with unspoken questions. His board began to worry about optics, image, risk. For them, emotion was a liability. Tom Miller, his longtime advisor, pulled him aside one morning. "You know how this looks? Michael, a CEO involved with a project lead. It's not a good story. We've worked too hard to build your reputation to let a rumor shake it." Michael's jaw tightened. "It's not a story," he said. "It's none of their business." Tom sighed, lowering his voice. "Maybe not to you, but to the world. Perception is reality. You know that better than anyone." He did. And yet, the thought of distancing himself from Evelyn felt like betrayal, not of policy, but of something far more personal. Still, the pressure built. The media loved a narrative that humanized power, especially if it could be twisted into scandal. Every time Michael and Evelyn were seen together at a meeting, a site visit, even walking out of the same building, it added fuel to the fire. Evelyn handled it the only way she knew how, with silence. She stopped staying late at the studio. She avoided shared lunches, avoided looking at him too long during meetings. Her quietness, once her strength, now felt like armor. But silence, when born of fear, doesn't heal. It isolates. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, Michael found her standing alone near the window, her reflection framed against the fading city lights. The air between them felt thick with everything they hadn't said. "They're getting louder, aren't they?" he asked. Evelyn didn't turn around. People always get louder when they're afraid of something real. He stepped closer. "Are you afraid?" She hesitated, her breath shallow. "Not of them." She paused, then added quietly, "Just of losing myself in all this noise." Michael wanted to tell her she wouldn't, that he wouldn't let that happen, but he stopped himself. Because promises, he'd learned, were fragile things. Instead, he said, "You didn't do anything wrong." Her eyes met his then, tired but steady. "I know," she whispered, "but sometimes doing nothing wrong doesn't protect you." That night, Michael sat in his penthouse. The city sprawled beneath him, lights flickering like distant stars. His phone buzzed with messages, calls from PR teams, urgent emails, warnings from investors, but he ignored them all. Instead, he found himself thinking about Evelyn's words, about the quiet dignity with which she faced a world determined to misunderstand her. He realized something then, something both humbling and painful. For all his wealth, his influence, his control, he couldn't protect her from this. Not from gossip, not from judgment, not from the loneliness of being watched. Meanwhile, Evelyn retreated further into her work. She poured herself into the park's design, her lines on the blueprints becoming more fluid, more soulful. It was her way of speaking when words felt too fragile. She designed not for approval, but for peace, perhaps, the peace she no longer felt inside herself. In the quiet of her apartment, she would sometimes reread the articles about her, letting the sting fade into numbness. Then she'd look at a small photo pinned to her refrigerator, her mother smiling in the sunlight of another lifetime, and remind herself that storms pass. They always do. But this storm felt different. This one wasn't in the sky. It was in people's eyes, in their whispers, in the cruel comfort of easy judgment. And though she stood tall in public, the solitude began to weigh on her. Nights grew longer, and even the rain, the sound she'd always loved, felt heavier now. Michael noticed her withdrawal, but didn't know how to reach her without making things worse. Every gesture, every word risked being misinterpreted, so he, too, grew quieter, caught between wanting to protect her and knowing he might be part of what she needed protection from. And so, two people who had once found peace in silence now found themselves prisoners of it. In the end, that was how the rumors won, not by proving anything true, but by making two souls afraid to be seen together. Yet, somewhere beneath the noise, something small and stubborn still survived. A belief that truth, like spring, would return, that whispers would fade, that the heart, if patient enough, could outlast even the cruelest kind of attention. And maybe, one day, the world would remember what they had almost forgotten, that not every connection born in silence deserves to be broken by noise. In the weeks that followed, the air between them changed. It wasn't sudden, no sharp words, no final goodbye. It was the kind of quiet drifting that happens when two people, once connected by unspoken understanding, begin to fear the very silence that had once brought them peace. The rumors still swirled, though softer now, like embers refusing to die out. But even when the noise faded from headlines, its echo lingered between them, where there had once been easy conversation. Now there were long pauses and guarded tones. Where there had once been late nights spent sketching together under the hum of rain, there was distance, polite, professional, deliberate. They spoke mostly through email now. The messages were efficient, courteous, stripped of anything personal. Subject revised fountain structure. Good morning, Mr. Hayes. I've attached the new layout for review. The contractor has approved the updated design for accessibility. Best, Evelyn Ross. Each word was perfectly chosen, each sentence polished, yet Michael could almost feel the restraint behind them, as if every line was built to keep him out. He would reply in kind, "Thank you. Evelyn, the design looks solid. Let's move forward with the revised plan." And that was it. Days turned into weeks of such exchanges, businesslike, clean, untouched by emotion. But beneath every brief message lay everything they weren't saying. Evelyn worked longer hours, pouring herself into the project. It was easier to get lost in blueprints than to confront the ache inside her. In the stillness of her apartment, surrounded by sketches and scattered papers, she often caught herself tracing lines that didn't belong to any design curves that resembled the arc of a hand, a smile, a memory. She would shake her head, exhale slowly, and remind herself of who she was before him, before the rumors, before her peace began to fracture under the weight of what she felt but couldn't name. Late one night, she paused over her drafting table and whispered to herself, "I designed for peace, but I've lost mine." The words startled her. They sounded foreign and familiar all at once, echoing softly in the room like a confession she hadn't meant to make. She tried to remind herself that her work mattered, that the park they were building would bring joy to others, that what they had, whatever it was, had been something good, even if fleeting. But still, the emptiness remained. It was a quiet grief, the kind that has no clear beginning and no end. Across the city, in his glass-walled penthouse, Michael sat alone at his desk, reading one of her latest reports. Her words, professional as ever, carried that same precision he'd once admired, but now they felt cold. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, the glow of the city stretching out beneath him. For years, he had mastered control. He'd built his world around it, control over people, over business, over his own heart. But for the first time, control felt like a cage. He thought of her words, her softness, her strength, her way of listening before she spoke. He missed it, though he couldn't admit that to anyone, least of all himself. His reflection in the window stared back at him, distant and tired. Power can buy silence, he thought, but not peace. And in that realization, something in him ached not with regret exactly, but with recognition. He had silenced his life in pursuit of control, and now, in the absence of her voice, he understood the cost. Their paths still crossed, of course, meetings, site visits, official reviews, but they spoke like strangers who remembered too much. He would greet her with a nod, she would respond with a polite smile. It was all so carefully measured, as if either of them saying too much might break the fragile truce they had built. Once, during a late afternoon site inspection, the rain began suddenly sharp and cold, the kind that turns sidewalks to mirrors. Everyone rushed for cover, laughing as they ran, everyone except Evelyn. She stood still beneath the downpour, eyes closed, her face turned toward the gray sky. Michael watched from the shelter of the temporary office canopy. Something in her stillness tugged at him the way she stood there, unflinching, letting the rain wash over her, as if trying to reclaim a part of herself the world had taken. He wanted to go to her, to say something, anything, but he stayed where he was. She didn't look back. That night, he wrote her a message he never sent. "You once told me people visit parks to remember how to breathe. Lately, I can't seem to remember how." He deleted it before it could reach her inbox. Some truths, he decided, were too heavy to share when silence had already done its damage. Evelyn, too, had unsent messages, words she typed in quiet moments, then erased before the cursor could blink twice. "You made me feel seen. I didn't know that could still happen." But she never pressed send. Instead, she kept designing. She drew winding paths that led to open gardens, bridges that connected quiet corners of the park, perhaps, subconsciously, building spaces where connection could still exist even when words failed. The distance between them wasn't measured in miles, but in unsaid thoughts, in the restraint that came from fear and pride and the fragile hope that maybe, someday, the silence would lift. For now, though, they lived in parallel, two souls still orbiting the same vision, bound by what they couldn't say. Seattle moved through its rhythm of rain and light. The park continued to rise, green and graceful, born from both of their hands. And perhaps that was their quiet redemption, that even from distance, something beautiful was still being built. Evelyn sometimes stood on the construction site at dusk, watching the outlines of the new fountain take shape. In those moments, she'd close her eyes and breathe, letting the sound of water in the distance remind her of what still mattered. And somewhere across the city, Michael would do the same, staring out his window, tracing the faint reflection of rain down the glass, whispering words meant only for the quiet. Neither of them knew if the distance would last, but both, in their own ways, were learning that silence isn't just absence, it's also space. Space to grow, space to remember, space to heal. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of peace finding its way back to them, not through power, not through noise, but through the quiet understanding that some connections, even when unspoken, never truly fade. Time moved differently after the distance settled between them. The Rainier Hill Park continued to rise, pathways paved, benches installed, the fountain beginning to take shape, but between Michael and Evelyn, a quiet emptiness remained. Their messages stayed brief, their meetings rare. It was easier that way, or at least that's what they both told themselves. Yet, some nights, when the city fell still and the hum of rain pressed against the glass, both found their thoughts wandering back to the same place, the unfinished park. It had become a kind of mirror for them, reflecting all the things they were trying not to feel. One late evening, when the forecast warned of heavy rain, Evelyn drove to the site alone. She told herself she was there to review the new lighting installation, but truthfully, she just needed to breathe. The city lights blurred in her rearview mirror as the first drops began to fall, streaking the windshield in crooked lines of silver. The park was empty when she arrived, shrouded in darkness except for the faint glow of the half-built fountain, its scaffolding glinting under the rain. The smell of wet cedar filled the air. Evelyn stepped out, pulling her coat tighter, and walked slowly along the unfinished path. Everything felt raw, suspended, the sound of water, the hiss of rain, the soft thud of her shoes on the muddy ground. She paused near the heart of the site, where the fountain would soon stand, and looked up at the sky. The rain soaked her hair, her clothes, but she didn't move. For weeks, she had tried to outrun the noise, to bury herself in blueprints and professionalism. But standing there, alone in the storm, she felt everything she had been holding back, the exhaustion, the fear, the longing. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, and through the blur of rain, she saw him. Michael Hayes. His black coat was drenched, his hair slick against his forehead, but his eyes, those steady, searching eyes, were fixed on her. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here," she said, her voice barely carrying over the rain. He took a few steps closer. Neither did I. They stood there, a few feet apart, the rain pouring between them like a curtain neither quite dared to cross. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no business here, no press, no audience, just two people who had once shared something real and lost it somewhere in the noise of the world. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "I thought maybe if I came here, it would feel different," she said softly. "This place was supposed to mean peace. Now it just feels like another unfinished thing." Michael looked around the half-built fountain, the muddy ground, the outlines of what would someday be beautiful. "Maybe that's what makes it real," he said. "Peace isn't perfect. It's built the same way this is, slowly, through mistakes." Evelyn gave a small, tired smile. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," he admitted. Not for people like us. The rain grew heavier, drumming on the scaffolding, streaking their faces. She looked at him, then really looked. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not power, not control, something gentler, almost uncertain. He stepped closer. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, carried only by the rain. "Why do you keep running from me?" Her breath caught. "Because you see too much." He frowned slightly. "Is that so terrible?" She shook her head, water dripping from her hair. "You don't understand. I've spent most of my life being invisible. It was easier that way. Safe. And now, when you look at me, it feels like standing under a spotlight I never asked for." He took another step closer, until he was near enough that she could see the rain glinting in his eyes. "You're scared of being seen." Her lips parted, the truth of it cutting through the noise. "I am," she whispered. Michael's voice softened. "Then let me see you anyway." The words hung between them, fragile and luminous, like something sacred whispered into the storm. Evelyn closed her eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the rain, the cold, even the trembling in her hands. She wanted to resist, to retreat back into her shell of quiet safety. But something in his tone, something steady and kind, broke through the fear. When she opened her eyes again, Michael was still there, his gaze unwavering. Not demanding, not trying to claim her, just seeing her. And in that look, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: acceptance. Not for who she tried to be, but for who she was. The rain softened, falling now like a gentle rhythm around them. She took a slow breath. "You don't know what it's like," she said quietly, "to build walls just to survive and then realize they've become your home." Michael nodded, his expression tender. "I do know. I built mine out of glass. They let people see me, but never close enough to touch." Evelyn studied him, her heart tightening at the honesty in his voice. In that moment, she saw the man behind the title, the boy who'd grown up learning that power was safer than tenderness. The rain gathered on the edges of the fountain, pooling where water would someday flow freely. Evelyn looked at it, then back at him. "Do you ever wish you could start over?" He smiled faintly. "Every day." Neither moved for a while. They just stood there in the rain, two souls stripped bare of their roles, their masks, their fear. The city lights shimmered through the downpour, reflecting off puddles like fractured stars. "Finally," Evelyn whispered, "I don't know if I can do this." Michael took a step closer, close enough now that their breath mingled in the cold air. "You don't have to know," he said. "Just stay. For a moment. Let yourself be seen." Her eyes met his, and for the first time in months, she didn't look away. The rain began to ease, the storm breaking into a soft drizzle. Around them, the unfinished park seemed to exhale the half-built fountain, the muddy paths, all of it glistening under the tender light of the street lamps. They stood together in the quiet aftermath, two people who had been lost in silence finally finding something worth breaking it for. No promises, no grand gestures, just presence. And perhaps that was enough for now. Because sometimes, recognition doesn't come from the world's applause or validation. Sometimes, it comes in the rain when one soul looks at another and simply says, "I see you." After that night in the rain, something in Michael shifted quietly, like a room inside him that had been locked for years had finally let in a little light. He didn't call Evelyn after their encounter. He didn't send an email or arrange a meeting. Somehow, both seemed to understand that what happened beneath that storm didn't need to be chased. It needed to breathe, still. She lingered in his thoughts, the image of her standing in the downpour, unflinching, eyes wide open as if letting the rain wash away everything she had been afraid to feel. There was something profoundly human about her courage, about the way she admitted her fear instead of hiding from it. And then, one afternoon, while reviewing project documents at his office, Michael came across a note in a staff file, a line he'd overlooked before. "Emergency contact, Linda Ross, Silver Pines Care Home." He read the name twice. Then again, Linda, her mother. He sat back, his mind replaying the conversation they had once shared in the quiet of the design studio. Evelyn had spoken of her mother with a tenderness that had pierced him. "She's at Silver Pines. Some days she remembers me. Some days, I'm just another kind stranger." The thought lingered through the rest of the day. He tried to return to his emails, to the endless meetings and signatures that filled his calendar, but the idea refused to leave. By evening, as twilight brushed against the Seattle skyline, he found himself driving out of the city. The rain had returned soft this time, like a whisper. The road curved through pine-lined hills, leading him toward a quiet stretch of land on the outskirts. A wooden sign read, "Silver Pines Care Home." He parked near the entrance and sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe concern, or maybe it was the quiet pull of wanting to understand the woman who had changed the rhythm of his life without meaning to. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and rain. The lobby was simple soft lighting, framed paintings of wildflowers, a piano tucked into the corner. A nurse greeted him kindly, her tone warm but curious when he mentioned Linda Ross. "She's in the garden room," the nurse said. "She likes to sit by the window when it rains." He thanked her and followed the corridor. The sound of soft music floated from somewhere down the hall. When he reached the open doorway, he paused. There she was. Linda Ross sat by a window, her hair silver and soft, a blanket folded neatly across her lap. She looked out at the drizzle beyond the glass, her profile serene, her eyes reflecting a gentleness that felt familiar. For a moment, Michael simply watched her. There was something in her presence, a quiet dignity, a stillness that reminded him of Evelyn, the same grace, the same inward strength. When he finally stepped forward, Linda turned toward him, studying his face with calm curiosity. "You're not one of the staff," she said, her voice light but clear. He smiled slightly. "No, ma'am, my name is Michael Hayes. I work with your daughter." "Evelyn," she said, her expression brightening. "My sweet girl. She works too much." Michael chuckled softly. "She does." Linda gestured for him to sit, and he did awkwardly at first, then with growing ease. They spoke for a while about simple things. The weather, the garden outside, the smell of pine after rain. She told him about the birds that came to her window every morning, about how she sometimes named them. She was always like that. "You know," Linda said after a while, her gaze drifting toward the gray sky. Quiet, thoughtful. Even as a child, she used to build little houses out of sticks and leaves, said she wanted to make spaces where people could rest. Michael listened, his chest tightening with something soft and unfamiliar. "She still does," he said quietly. "She builds peace wherever she can." Linda smiled, a faint, wistful curve of her lips. "She gets that from her father. He used to say the world moves too fast, and someone has to remind it to slow down." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The rain tapped gently against the window. Then Linda looked at him again, her eyes suddenly sharper, as if some thread of memory had caught hold. "You care about her, don't you?" Michael hesitated. He wasn't used to being seen through so easily. "I do," he said finally. "More than I expected to." Linda's gaze softened. "Then, be patient with her. My daughter disappears when she's scared. Maybe you can teach her to stay." The words landed in him like a quiet revelation, simple, but profound. He nodded, his throat tight. "I'll try," he said. She smiled, turning her eyes back to the rain. "That's all any of us can do." They talked a little longer about Evelyn's favorite flowers, about how Linda missed the sound of her daughter's laughter. There was no heaviness in the conversation, no sentimentality, just two souls sharing a sliver of understanding in the midst of life's constant noise. When it was time to leave, Linda reached out and took his hand gently. Her touch was cool but steady. "Tell her I said hello," she said, "and tell her. She's braver than she thinks." Michael swallowed hard, nodding again. I will. Outside. The rain had eased into a mist. He stood by his car for a long moment, looking back at the warm glow of the windows. Inside, he could still see her silhouette by the glass, peaceful, still, watching the rain. As he drove back toward the city, the words she'd spoken echoed in his mind. My daughter disappears when she's scared. Maybe you can teach her to stay. He realized then that Evelyn's strength, the calm, the composure, the careful distance had come at a cost. It was armor, yes, but also a kind of exile. And maybe, just maybe, his role wasn't to break through her walls, but to wait at the edge of them until she decided, on her own, to open the door. By the time he reached the city, the rain had stopped completely. The streets gleamed under the streetlights, quiet and reflective. Michael parked near the park site, stepping out to look at the emerging fountain glistening in the moonlight. It wasn't finished yet, but it was beginning to take shape, imperfect, incomplete, but beautiful. He smiled faintly. Some things, he thought, are worth waiting for. And somewhere beyond the horizon of all their unspoken words, a seed of understanding began to grow. That love, in its truest form, isn't about reaching for what you want. It's about staying, even when the rain hasn't stopped yet. The day after visiting Silver Pines, Michael couldn't stop replaying Linda Ross's words in his mind. My daughter disappears when she's scared. Maybe you can teach her to stay. He had gone there without a plan, without an agenda, but he'd left with something that felt almost sacred, a deeper understanding of the quiet strength behind Evelyn's reserve, and the tenderness she tried so hard to protect from the world. For a brief moment, he felt closer to her, even in her absence. But closeness built on secrets never lasts long. 3 days later, Evelyn found out. It happened by accident, a phone call from the care home to her office, meant as a polite courtesy. Your friend, Mr. Hayes, stopped by last week, the nurse said cheerfully. Your mother seems so happy. The words hung in the air, simple and harmless. But to Evelyn, they landed like a sudden crack in glass. Her heart skipped, her breath shortened. He went there without telling me. For a long moment, she sat still, her pen frozen above a half-finished sketch. Then she stood, grabbed her coat, and walked out into the gray afternoon, her thoughts a blur of disbelief and anger and something deeper hurt. By the time she reached the park site, the rain had already started again, soft but steady. Michael was there, standing under the scaffolding near the fountain, reviewing construction plans with one of the engineers. He looked up as she approached, immediately sensing the shift in her expression. Evelyn, he began, his tone calm, almost relieved to see her. I was hoping, but she cut him off. Did you visit my mother? He froze. The question wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the air around them. Yes, he said finally. I did. Her eyes darkened. Why? He stepped forward slightly. Because I wanted to understand you better. You had no right, she interrupted, her voice trembling. That's my life, Michael, my mother, my past. You don't just walk into that because you're curious. He opened his mouth to explain, but she shook her head. You think you can fix everything by getting involved, don't you? You think care means control, but it doesn't. The rain picked up, a soft percussion between them. Michael took a breath, his own voice low but steady. That's not why I went. Then why? She demanded. He hesitated, the truth pressing at the edges of his composure. Because you keep walls around everything that matters to you. And I thought maybe if I could see the world that made you, I'd understand the silence you live in. She blinked, as if his words had momentarily disarmed her. But the pain remained. You don't get to understand me through someone else, she said. That's not connection, that's intrusion. He nodded slowly, the rain sliding down his face. You're right, I crossed a line. But I didn't go for approval. Evelyn. He paused, his voice softening into something that almost trembled. I went to understand. The words hung between them, caught somewhere between apology and confession. For a moment, the only sound was the rain steady, relentless, washing through the tension like an unseen witness. Evelyn turned away, running a hand through her damp hair. Her heart was pounding, not just from anger, but from the vulnerability his words uncovered. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered, "to spend your life being careful, guarding what little peace you have left, and then someone comes along and thinks it's theirs to touch." Michael's voice was quiet, almost pleading. "I wasn't trying to take anything from you." "Then what were you trying to do?" He took a step closer, his expression raw now, stripped of the calm authority he wore like armor. "I was trying to see you, really see you. Not as the architect, not as the woman who hides behind her work. Just you." Her breath caught. "And what if I don't want to be seen?" He gave a faint, sad smile. "Then I'll still be here, because I think the parts you hide are the ones that make you human." Evelyn turned toward him, then, eyes shining not from tears, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding too much inside. "You don't understand," she said softly. "When people see me, they expect something, and when I can't give it, they leave. So I learned not to let them close enough to start expecting." Michael met her gaze, unflinching. "Then maybe I'm not here to expect. Maybe I'm here to stay." The words were quiet but certain, and in them, she heard something she hadn't heard in a long time: sincerity without demand. The tension in her shoulders eased, though only slightly. "You shouldn't have gone," she said again, softer now. "I know," he replied, "but I'm not sorry I did." She looked at him, startled. He went on, "Your mother reminded me of something I forgot, that kindness doesn't need permission. That sometimes the only way to really understand someone is to sit quietly in the space they came from." Evelyn took a long, uneven breath. "What did she say?" Michael's voice lowered. "She said you disappear when you're scared, and that maybe someone could teach you to stay." The silence that followed was deep and fragile, like the pause between heartbeats. Evelyn turned her eyes toward the half-finished fountain nearby, its skeletal frame glistening with rain. "She would say that," she murmured. "She always wanted me to stay longer than I could." Michael watched her, the rain soaking his coat, but he didn't move. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I don't want to be another reason you run." She closed her eyes. "Then don't chase me." He nodded slowly. "I won't." And for the first time, that promise didn't sound like defeat. It sounded like respect. They stood in silence as the rain softened, the air between them no longer sharp with anger, but heavy with understanding. The confrontation that began with fury ended not in reconciliation, but in truth. They were two people who had spent years mastering control. He through power, she through restraint, and now they were learning, painfully, that love isn't something to command. It's something to stand in, quietly, until it reveals what's real. When Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You really went there, just to understand." Michael nodded once. "I did." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face, his tone, the way his eyes didn't waver. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost like release, she said, "Maybe you did." The rain eased to a mist. A bird darted between the half-built trees of the park, its wings glinting against the fading light. Michael smiled faintly, though his eyes carried something tender and tired. "Then, that's enough for today," he said. Evelyn didn't answer, but when she turned to walk away, she didn't walk fast this time. And he didn't follow. He simply stood there, watching the distance between them stretch but not break, knowing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for someone is to give them space to find their own way back. Because understanding, he realized, isn't about holding on. It's about seeing someone clearly and letting them know they've been seen. After that confrontation in the rain, something fragile but real had begun to take root between them. There were no apologies, no declarations, just a quiet acknowledgement that, beneath the anger, there was understanding. For the first time, they had spoken their truths, even when those truths hurt. But the world outside didn't care about truths. It cared about headlines. The following week, everything changed. It began with a single photo grainy, taken from a distance, but potent enough to ignite speculation. Michael Hayes, the untouchable CEO, standing close to Evelyn Ross at the Rainier Hill site, both caught in a frame of soft gray rain and unspoken intimacy. Someone had sent it to the press with a caption that did not need words: Seattle's power couple or scandal in the making. Within hours, the image was everywhere in news feeds, business forums, gossip sites. The story spread faster than any statement could catch it. Some painted it as romance, others as impropriety. By morning, it had become the top trending topic in Seattle. For Michael, the fallout came swiftly. The board demanded meetings. Investors called, anxious about public image. His assistant fielded dozens of interview requests, while PR drafted statements that sounded polished but hollow. Inside the glass walls of his office, Michael sat in silence, staring at the photo glowing on his computer screen. The rain had blurred the edges of their faces, but not enough to hide the tenderness in their expressions. Tom Miller, his oldest advisor and the man who had helped build his empire, stood across the room with a tablet full of reports. His voice was calm, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "This is getting out of control," Tom said. "The shareholders are restless. The board is talking about possible damage to the company's reputation. You know how these things go, Michael. It's not about truth, it's about optics." Michael leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Optics," he repeated. "Funny how that word's become more important than integrity." Tom exhaled, tired. "You know I'm on your side. But this isn't just about you anymore. Evelyn's involvement in the Rainier Hill project, her connection to you, makes this a liability. People are asking if she got the contract because of you." Michael's eyes flickered with quiet anger. "She earned that contract. Every line, every design, every sleepless night she earned it." "I know that," Tom said gently. "But the public doesn't. And right now, perception is the only thing we can't control. The best move for you, for the company, is to let her go." The words hung heavy in the room. Let her go. Michael looked up slowly, his gaze sharp, cutting through the haze of logic and fear that filled the air. "You're suggesting I fire her? For what? For being seen standing next to me in the rain?" Tom hesitated. "I'm suggesting damage control. If you don't act, someone else will. The board will pressure you until they get what they want. And when they do, it won't just be her job at risk, it'll be yours." Michael stood, walking to the window. The city stretched below him, glittering, restless, alive. He'd spent years building this empire, brick by brick, deal by deal. He had traded youth for power, connection for control. Everything he'd achieved now stood on the edge of public opinion, waiting for his decision. He thought of Evelyn's face the night of their argument, the anger, the hurt, the truth in her eyes when she said, "You don't know what it's like to guard your peace." He did now, because for the first time in years, he wasn't guarding his empire, he was guarding something real, something human. He turned back to Tom, his expression calm but resolute. "No," he said quietly. Tom blinked. "No, I'm not letting her go," Michael said. "Not because of gossip, not because people can't handle the idea that I might care about someone without an agenda." Tom frowned, setting the tablet down. "Michael, this isn't like you. You spent your entire career protecting the company's image. You never let emotion drive your choices." "Maybe that's the problem," Michael said. "Maybe I've spent too long making decisions that kept me safe, not right." Tom shook his head. "You're risking everything for a woman who may not even want to be part of this anymore." Michael's tone softened. "It's not about what she wants from me. It's about what I owe her to be the kind of man she made me remember I could be." Tom studied him for a long moment, realizing there would be no changing his mind. Finally, he sighed. "Then you'd better be ready for the consequences." Michael gave a small, knowing smile. "For once, I think I am." That evening, when the story hit national outlets, Michael released a public statement not written by PR, not softened by spin. It was brief, honest, and entirely his own. Rumors are easy, truth is patient. The Rainier Hill Park remains a partnership built on respect, talent, and shared vision. That's all the story there ever was. The press wanted more, but he didn't feed them. And for the first time, he didn't hide behind his company's polished silence. Evelyn read the statement late that night. She was sitting by her window, the city lights flickering across her sketches. When she saw his words, her breath caught not because they were grand, but because they were enough. He hadn't denied knowing her. He hadn't distanced himself to protect his image. He had stood still, quietly, in the storm. It wasn't a grand gesture of love. It was something rarer, a gesture of respect. At the office the next morning, Tom entered Michael's office holding a stack of newspapers. "You're trending again," he said dryly. Michael smiled faintly. "I can live with that." Outside, the rain began to fall once more, streaking the tall glass windows like veins of silver. For years, rain had been a backdrop to his ambition, a thing he watched, not something he felt. But now, it meant something different. It meant truth, cleansing, renewal. And as he stood looking out at the skyline, Michael Hayes, the man who once believed control was everything, felt a strange kind of peace in choosing principle over power. He knew this decision would cost him. The board would question his judgment. The media would twist his intentions. But he also knew that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't defined by what he protected. He was defined by what he refused to sacrifice. And somewhere, beneath that same gray sky, Evelyn Ross was quietly beginning to understand the same thing that sometimes strength isn't in building walls to keep yourself safe. It's in standing still when the storm demands that you run. After the storm of headlines faded into quieter murmurs, something inside Michael Hayes changed, not in a dramatic, world-shifting way, but in the quiet, steady way the tide reshapes a shoreline over time. He began to see things differently. Meetings felt heavier, conversations about profit emptier. The numbers and charts that once fueled him now looked like walls instead of windows. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not his success, but its cost. The Rainier Hill Park project continued, slowly regaining public favor. The controversy that had once surrounded his name began to settle, but Michael felt no relief. He had won the battle of perception, yet somehow he didn't feel victorious. Then came the new project proposal, an enormous real estate development on the city's south side. Gleaming towers, luxury retail, private complexes. It was, by all definitions, a financial triumph waiting to happen. His board celebrated it as their next crown jewel. But when Michael read through the details, a heaviness settled in his chest. The project's construction would require clearing several blocks of affordable housing, displacing families, small businesses, and the very neighborhoods that had shaped the city's character. On paper, it was progress. In truth, it was erasure. He sat in his office long after everyone else had gone, staring out at the Seattle skyline, the same skyline he had built piece by piece, unaware that somewhere along the way, he had stopped building for people and started building for pride. The rain began again that night, soft but unrelenting. It tapped against the glass like a quiet reminder of the promise he once made to stand for something more than power. The next morning, Michael called an emergency board meeting. Tom Miller and the other executives filed in, their faces composed, confident. They assumed it was to finalize the deal. Instead, Michael stood at the head of the table, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm withdrawing our company from the Harbor Line development," he said simply. The words fell like stones into still water. Tom blinked, what Michael repeated, slower this time. "We're not moving forward with it." One of the board members leaned forward. "Michael, with all due respect, this project could generate hundreds of millions in profit. The city's practically begging for it." Michael nodded. "And in the process, we'd be destroying entire communities. Do you really think we can call that progress?" Another voice, sharper now. "This isn't about morality. It's business. Michael met their eyes, one by one. That's exactly the problem. The room went silent. For years, his authority had been built on precision, logic, and strategy. But now, his words carried something deeper conviction. I've spent my life chasing growth, he continued. But growth means nothing if it comes at the cost of people's lives. We build towers that touch the sky, but forget who's living in the shadows below them. Tom sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Michael, the investors will lose their minds. The press will eat you alive. You can't just walk away from a deal like this. Michael smiled faintly, but his eyes held a quiet strength. I've survived worse storms, and this time, I'd rather stand in one for the right reason. When the meeting ended, the board left in tense silence, but Michael stayed behind, standing by the window as the city stretched before him. He thought of Evelyn, of the park, of the gentle wisdom in her mother's words. My daughter disappears when she's scared. Maybe you can teach her to stay. Maybe, he thought, this was what staying looked like, not in love, but in truth. By evening, the news broke Hayes Corporation withdraws from multi-billion-dollar development citing ethical concerns. The reaction was immediate shock, criticism, admiration. Some called it a PR stunt. Others called it leadership. The headlines churned, social media debated, analysts speculated. But for Michael, none of that mattered. For once, he wasn't measuring success by applause. That night, Evelyn saw the story on television. She was at home, sitting on the floor surrounded by sketches for the final phase of the park. The anchor's voice was calm, clinical, but the message was clear. Michael Hayes had chosen conscience over profit. She sat in silence, the faint sound of rain outside her window. 1,000 emotions stirred inside her: pride, sadness, something like longing. She understood what this choice meant for him. It wasn't just business, it was redemption. But she also knew what it would cost him: reputation, trust from his board, perhaps even the empire he had built. And she realized, painfully, that his transformation, the very thing she had once hoped for, might also be the thing that pushed them further apart. They hadn't spoken in weeks, not since the confrontation, not since their last fragile truce. She had kept her distance, trying to protect both of them from the noise of the world. But now, as she watched his image flicker across the TV screen, she felt an ache she couldn't quiet. He had changed, truly changed. The man who once measured life in power had chosen to lose it for the sake of integrity. And though she knew it might leave him standing alone, she also knew it was the right choice. The next morning, she went to the park early. The sun was just beginning to rise, the air damp and fresh after the night's rain. The fountain was nearly complete now, its curves glinting softly in the morning light. Evelyn stood at the edge of the construction site, looking at the space they had built together, a place meant for rest, for renewal, for belonging. And as she stood there, she whispered quietly, "You did the right thing." There was no one to hear it, but somehow she knew the words would find him. Across the city, Michael sat alone in his office. The world outside bathed in the same soft dawn. The news still buzzed, the consequences still looming, but beneath it all, there was peace, real peace. He didn't know where he stood with Evelyn, or if their paths would ever cross again. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of distance. Because this time, it wasn't built on pride or misunderstanding, it was built on respect. She had taught him something he hadn't learned in all his years of power, that true strength isn't in winning battles, it's in knowing which ones not to fight. The rain clouds began to part, letting sunlight spill across the skyline. And in that quiet moment, Michael Hayes understood that he hadn't lost something in walking away. He had simply made room for something better, not success, not applause, but dignity. And somewhere across the city, Evelyn Ross lifted her face to the same morning light, knowing that even though their paths were drifting apart, their hearts, like the park they built, would always be connected by the choice to do what was right. After Michael's decision to withdraw from the Harbor Line project, the city rippled with disbelief. It was the kind of move no one expected from him, selfless, principled, almost poetic in its defiance. The media called it reckless. His board called it naive. But those who knew him, or thought they did, could only say one thing: Michael Hayes had changed. Evelyn heard about it before dawn, from a coworker who couldn't hide his awe. She didn't say much in reply, just a small, knowing smile, and then she went back to her sketches. But inside, something gentle stirred, a mixture of admiration, sadness, and pride that caught her off guard. It had been weeks since they'd spoken. Their last conversation had ended in quiet understanding, a fragile peace built not on promises, but on truth. And now, as she read through the morning paper, her hands trembled slightly when she saw his picture beside the headline, "CEO walks away from billion-dollar deal. Some costs can't be measured in profit." She traced the words with her fingertips. There he was, Michael, standing before reporters, not as the untouchable man she'd first met, but as someone fully human. That night, after a long day at the park site, Evelyn sat by her window, a cup of tea cooling beside her, the rain whispering against the glass. The city was quiet, suspended in the kind of stillness that always made her think of him. The fountain was nearly complete now. The pathways were paved, the gardens planted. Soon, the park would open to the public, a space for people to breathe again. And yet, despite the sense of completion all around her, she felt something unfinished inside. That was when she decided to write. It wasn't planned. Her hands simply reached for paper, for the same fountain pen she used to sign architectural drafts. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and searching, but as they found their rhythm, so did her heart. "Dear Michael, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe that's why I can finally write it. You made me remember that kindness can still exist in power. I had forgotten that people in your world could care about more than themselves, that success didn't always have to mean stepping over someone else's peace. You reminded me that courage isn't always loud, that sometimes it's quiet, steady, and costly. When you chose to walk away from that project, I realized something I couldn't admit before. You didn't need to prove anything to anyone. You just needed to be who you were trying to remember. And you did." She paused, setting the pen down, her chest tightening as she read over the lines. There was more she wanted to say, but every word felt heavy, like stepping across a fragile bridge that might not hold. Outside, the rain deepened, tapping gently against the window pane. It reminded her of the night they'd stood together in the park, the storm washing everything clean, the fear, the pretense, the distance. She remembered his words, "Then let me see you anyway." And for the first time, she allowed herself to admit how much that moment had mattered. She picked up the pen again. "I've always believed that solitude was safety, that silence could protect me from being hurt. But now I see that silence can also be a wall that keeps the good things out. You taught me that being seen isn't the same as being exposed. Sometimes, it's how healing begins." Her handwriting wavered. She pressed her palm flat against the page, as if to steady both the paper and her heart. "I don't know where we go from here. Maybe nowhere. Maybe this is where our stories part. But if that's the case, I want you to know this. You left something behind that no one else ever could. You gave me permission to stop hiding." She stopped again, tears pricking her eyes, not of regret, but of release. The kind that comes when you realize some connections don't need to be defined to be real. There was a final line she wanted to write, one that had been sitting in her chest for days, but her hand hesitated above the paper. "You changed me, Michael Hayes, not by loving me, but by showing me that love can exist quietly in decency, in courage, in choosing what's right when no one's watching." When she finished, she signed her name softly at the bottom. Evelyn, for a long while, she just sat there, staring at the letter in the dim light. The rain outside softened, fading into mist. The city glowed faintly beyond the window, its edges blurred like memory. She folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, but didn't write his address. She didn't even seal it. Instead, she tucked it into the drawer beside her bed, alongside a handful of other things she couldn't yet let go of: old photographs, a faded sketch of the park's first draft, a postcard from a trip she'd never taken. The letter wasn't meant to be sent. It was meant to be understood. Because sometimes, writing is a way of staying when words can't be spoken. That night, Evelyn lay in bed, listening to the hum of the rain gutter outside, feeling the ache of something that was both loss and gratitude. She knew she would see him again. Perhaps not soon, perhaps not at all, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had both learned how to stand still long enough to face themselves. Across the city, Michael sat in his office, surrounded by the quiet hum of midnight. On his desk sat a small sketch she had left behind months ago, a fountain drawn in pencil, with the words, "Stillness is also" movement scribbled in the corner. He traced the line of the fountain with his thumb, smiling faintly. He didn't know about the letter she never sent, but maybe he didn't need to. Some truths don't need to travel far. They live quietly between two people who once shared the same rain. And in that unspoken space, both of them found something that resembled peace, not the kind that comes from endings, but from knowing the story didn't need one. Because sometimes, closure isn't a door shutting behind you. Sometimes, it's the window you leave slightly open, so the light can still find its way in. The letter sat in Evelyn's drawer for weeks, untouched, but never forgotten. She didn't reread it. She didn't need to. The words had already done their work the moment she wrote them. They had freed her from the weight of everything unspoken. Meanwhile, life went on, quietly. The Rainier Hill Park was nearly complete. The construction fences came down. The fountains were tested. The flowers planted. People had begun to gather around its gates, curious to see what the city had built. Evelyn visited often, not as the architect this time, but as a woman learning how to breathe again. She'd stand by the fountain she designed, the one shaped like a spiral, flowing inward before spilling out, watching the water move with rhythm and grace. It reminded her that life, like water, always found its way forward. She hadn't seen Michael since the day his company withdrew from the Harbor Line project. He had disappeared from the public eye, refusing interviews, skipping events, quietly stepping away from the noise. The press had lost interest eventually, moving on to fresher scandals. But sometimes, when she least expected it, she would feel his presence in small, ordinary moments, the way rain sounded on glass, the way light shifted across a blueprint, the way silence could feel like understanding instead of absence. Then, one afternoon, he came back. It was a gray day, the kind Seattle knew by heart. The air smelled faintly of pine and earth after rain. Evelyn was at the park, overseeing the last phase of planting along the western path. She didn't hear him approach at first. Only when the workers called it a day and the quiet settled did she notice a familiar silhouette standing by the fountain. Michael. He was dressed simply, no suit, no armor of authority, just a dark jacket. The collar turned up against the chill, his hair flecked with a few strands of silver. He looked older somehow, but lighter, as though the weight he once carried had finally begun to lift. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle rush of water from the fountain and the soft breeze rustling the leaves. Evelyn broke the silence first. "You found it," she said. He smiled faintly. "I needed to see it finished." She nodded, unsure what else to say. So much had been said between them before, and so much had been left unsaid. Michael walked closer, his steps unhurried. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He just stood beside her, both of them looking at the fountain. The water shimmered in the muted light, flowing in soft circles, endlessly returning to itself. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "Peaceful." Evelyn looked at him, her expression soft but guarded. That's what it was meant to be. He turned to her then, and for the first time in months, their eyes met without hesitation. There was no tension now, no unfinished arguments, just a deep familiarity, a recognition of everything they had survived, separately and together. "I read about your mother," Michael said gently. "How is she?" Evelyn exhaled, her gaze lowering. "She's fading, but she has good days." Then, after a pause, she added, "She still remembers the rain. She says it sounds like forgiveness. Michael smiled sadly. She sounds like you. Evelyn shook her head. No, she's braver than I am. He hesitated, watching her profile, the way her hair caught the light, the way her voice trembled slightly when she tried to sound strong. You're wrong, he said quietly. You're stronger than you think. You always have been. His words weren't meant as flattery. They came from somewhere truer, a place of gratitude, of knowing. Evelyn swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in her eyes. Why are you here, Michael? He took a deep breath, not to ask for anything, not to fix what's already broken. I just didn't want to leave things on silence. She nodded slowly, her heart heavy with both understanding and fear. Sometimes silence is safer, she murmured. Maybe, he said, but sometimes it's just a wall we forget to tear down. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth even through the chill air. His voice softened. You don't have to promise forever. Evelyn, just honesty. Her breath caught. The simplicity of the request undid her more than any declaration ever could. He wasn't asking for guarantees, for labels, for certainty. He was asking for truth, for presence, for the courage to stop running from the very thing they both feared most, being seen. Something inside her cracked open then. A small, fragile part she'd been protecting for years finally let go. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She turned away, embarrassed, but her voice betrayed her. I don't know if I can, she whispered. Michael didn't reach for her. He didn't try to close the distance. He simply stood beside her, steady, patient, his presence enough. Then start with that, he said softly. With not knowing, with being scared, with trying anyway. Her shoulders trembled, and for the first time in years, Evelyn Ross, the woman who built her life out of composure and control, began to cry. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost reverent. The kind of tears that come when walls finally crumble, when the heart realizes it's safe enough to feel again. Michael stayed beside her, silent, letting the moment unfold. He didn't touch her, didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, as the man who once believed power was everything learned the sacred strength of stillness. After a while, Evelyn wiped her face and let out a shaky breath. Half a laugh. I'm sorry, she said. I don't know why I'm crying. He smiled gently. Maybe because you don't have to be strong right now. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the CEO, not the myth the world had built, but the man who had chosen empathy over ambition, integrity over image, the man who had stood in the rain with her once and told her she didn't have to hide. Something like peace settled between them, not the sharp, intoxicating kind that comes from reconciliation, but the soft kind that comes when both hearts finally stop fighting. They talked a little after that about her mother, about the park's opening, about the small, ordinary things that tether people to life. When the light began to fade and the city hummed faintly in the distance, Evelyn turned toward him and said, Thank you for coming. He nodded, his eyes kind. Thank you for letting me. When he left, she didn't call after him. She didn't need to, because some goodbyes don't close a story, they simply honor it. As the last of the sunlight touched the fountain, Evelyn sat on a nearby bench, watching the water catch the glow. She could still feel his presence, quiet and steady, lingering like the scent of rain after it's gone. And in that stillness, something within her healed not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe, enough to stay. Enough to finally believe that even the silence, when broken gently, can sound a lot like love. After that quiet meeting at the park, the tears, the honesty, the fragile peace, Evelyn didn't see Michael again for a long while. They hadn't made any promises, and perhaps that was what made it real. What was left between them wasn't romance or longing, but something softer, something that lived quietly in the space between gratitude and acceptance. They had met each other at their most human, and that was enough. Spring came early that year. Seattle unfolded in shades of green and gold, the kind of light that made even old buildings look forgiving. The Rainier Hill Park, after years of planning and struggle, was finally ready to open. On the morning of the dedication ceremony, Evelyn arrived before the crowds. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh soil and blooming lilacs. Workers were putting the finishing touches on the benches, brushing away the last traces of dust. She walked slowly through the pathways, her fingers grazing the smooth railings, the stone curves, the little mosaic tiles that children from local schools had painted by hand. It was all there now, everything she had imagined when the project was still just a dream on paper. The park had become what she had hoped it would be, a breathing space in the middle of the city, a place that invited stillness without asking for silence. As the first visitors began to arrive, Evelyn stepped back, watching the scene unfold like a living painting. Families wandered in, their laughter mingling with the sound of water splashing from the fountain. Children ran barefoot across the grass, chasing one another through the mist that rose from the water's edge. The fountain itself shimmered in the sunlight, its spiral design creating endless motion, water flowing inward, then outward again, in a perfect balance of movement and rest. A little boy stopped at the edge, tossing a penny into the pool. His mother smiled, holding his small hand, and Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she had done it, not for the recognition, not for the headlines, but for this, the sense of belonging that can only exist when people are free to simply be. She found herself smiling, not the professional kind that photographs capture, but the quiet kind that comes from seeing something come full circle. For years, she had built spaces for others to find peace. But now, standing here, surrounded by life and laughter, she realized she had found some for herself too. A reporter approached her, notebook in hand, eager to capture a quote. "Ms. Ross," he said, "how does it feel to see your vision finally complete?" Evelyn looked around, her gaze drifting to the trees, to the children, to the fountain's soft rhythm. "It feels," she said slowly, "like the city remembered how to breathe." The reporter nodded, scribbling her words, but Evelyn's thoughts had already moved elsewhere toward a memory, toward a man who had once stood beside her in this very place when it was only scaffolding and mud. Michael. She hadn't heard from him in months. Word around the city was that he had stepped back from corporate life, that he'd taken time away traveling, working quietly with community projects, investing in things that actually helped people. The man who once measured life in profits had learned, at last, to measure it in purpose. She wondered if he knew the park had opened today. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. It didn't matter, she told herself. Some stories didn't need to be revisited to remain real. Still, as the afternoon sun shifted across the fountain's surface, she felt a faint pull in her chest, like the echo of a song she thought she'd forgotten. And then, almost as if the thought had summoned him, she saw him. At first, just a silhouette at the far end of the walkway, tall, still, familiar. He wasn't dressed like a man of business anymore, just a gray coat, a simple scarf, his hands in his pockets. Michael Hayes. He stood quietly, watching from a distance, not imposing, not trying to claim space just there. Evelyn's breath caught, for a moment. The noise around her faded, the laughter, the chatter, the hum of the city. All of it softened into background music to a silence that was full, not empty. Their eyes met across the space between them. He didn't move closer. He didn't have to. The distance between them wasn't painful anymore. It was simply part of what they were, a kind of peace, earned through everything they had endured. Evelyn gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He returned it, his expression warm, proud, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. Neither spoke. There were no words left that needed saying. She turned her gaze back to the fountain, watching the water dance in the sunlight. When she looked again, he was gone, melted into the crowd, or maybe into the rhythm of the day itself. But somehow, she didn't feel his absence, because in that fleeting moment, she understood not all presence demands permanence. Some people are meant to walk with us for only part of the journey, but their footprints stay. even when the path continues on. As the day went on, the park filled with music and laughter. Children splashed in the fountain, the air rang with joy, and the city seemed, for once, at peace with itself. Evelyn walked among the people, unnoticed, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. She stopped near a tree at the center of the park, one that would someday grow tall and cast wide shade. A plaque at its base read, "Dedicated to those who build not for power, but for people." Evelyn smiled softly. The words felt right. As the sun began to set, she sat on a nearby bench, letting the golden light warm her face. The fountain's reflection shimmered on the pavement, and in it, she saw the faint outline of two figures: herself, and the memory of the man who had once stood beside her. It wasn't a goodbye, not really. It was something gentler, a recognition that some connections, no matter how quietly they end, remain alive in the spaces they helped create. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the park. The air smelled of lilacs and rain. Evelyn closed her eyes and let it all wash over her: the peace, the noise, the life. And in that still, glowing moment, she understood that every story, no matter how turbulent its beginning, has the chance to end in grace. The garden had bloomed, the city had found its heart again, and she finally had found hers too. The opening day of the park ended quietly, the way all meaningful things do. When the crowd dispersed and the laughter faded, only the sound of water from the fountain remained soft, rhythmic, eternal. The sun had long set, but the lamplight shimmered on the wet stones, turning the paths into ribbons of gold. Evelyn stayed behind after everyone left. She walked the winding path she had drawn years ago on tracing paper, her fingers grazing the railings, her shoes damp from dew. Everything was alive: the faint buzz of crickets, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of wind through leaves that had only just learned to dance. The city around her breathed in a way she hadn't heard before: slow, steady, healed. She sat down on a stone bench beneath a young maple tree, its branches arching gently overhead. It would grow tall one day, she thought, long after she was gone. That was the beauty of creating something meant to last. You never owned it. You only began it. Across the park, the fountain continued to glimmer. Its spiral flow seemed endless, looping in and out, like the rhythm of all the lives that had crossed to make this place real. Evelyn smiled faintly, her hands resting on her lap. She wasn't waiting for anyone, at least. That's what she told herself. She was simply letting the quiet fold around her like a familiar blanket. But then, as if the evening had other plans, she heard footsteps approaching. She didn't turn immediately. Something in the pace of those steps, steady, unhurried, felt both new and familiar. When she finally looked up, she saw him, Michael. He looked different now, not in the way that time changes a face, but in the way peace softens it. The sharp edges of ambition were gone, replaced by something calmer, more human. He wasn't the man who once commanded rooms. He was just a man walking through a park he helped create, in search of a moment that mattered. He stopped a few feet away. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said quietly. Evelyn smiled, just a little. "I wasn't sure either." He chuckled softly and gestured to the bench. "May I?" She nodded. He sat beside her, not too close, not too far. The space between them was the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. They watched the fountain together, the water catching bits of lamplight and tossing them back into the night. For a while, neither spoke. There was no need. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp grass and lilacs. Somewhere nearby, a child's forgotten balloon tugged softly at a tree branch. Finally, Michael broke the quiet. "It's beautiful," he said. "You gave this city something it didn't know it needed." Evelyn's eyes stayed on the fountain. "We both did." He turned to her. "Maybe, but you were the heart of it." She shook her head gently. "You gave it its conscience." A faint smile passed between them, one that didn't need explanation. He leaned back slightly, exhaling as if releasing years of unspoken things. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," he said. "Not in business, just in life. For the first time, I don't have a plan. And somehow, that feels right. Evelyn nodded. Maybe that's what peace looks like, letting the next chapter write itself. He looked at her then, and in his gaze was something soft but steady, a gratitude that didn't need words. You once told me you designed for peace, he said quietly. Did you find it? She thought for a moment. Not the kind I expected, she said. But maybe peace isn't about being untouched by pain. Maybe it's about knowing you can survive it and still stay kind. Michael smiled, his eyes glinting under the faint light. That sounds like you, she laughed softly. Maybe it sounds like you, too. The rain began again, not a storm this time, but a gentle drizzle, light as breath. It pattered softly on the bench, darkening the stone. Evelyn tilted her face upward, letting the drops touch her skin. Michael didn't move. He simply stayed beside her, his hands resting loosely, his coat catching the rain. You don't have to stay, she said, though her voice carried no real resistance. He glanced at her, his expression calm. Some stories don't end with fireworks, he said. They end with someone staying even when it's raining. The words lingered between them, simple yet full, as if the night itself wanted to keep them. Evelyn looked at him, tears mingling with the rain. But this time, they weren't from sadness. They were from something deeper, a recognition that kindness, at its core, is the most courageous thing of all, because staying when it would be easier to walk away was its own kind of bravery. They sat there for a long time, two figures beneath a young tree in a park that had once been just an idea. Around them, the city moved in distant rhythms, cars passing, laughter echoing, life going on. Neither tried to capture the moment or define it. It didn't need to be labeled or promised. It simply was. When the rain lightened, Michael stood, brushing water from his sleeve. I should go, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded, her smile tender but sure. Thank you for staying. He paused, looking at her one last time. Thank you for teaching me how. Then he walked away, his figure fading slowly down the path, the sound of his steps blending with the soft hum of the city. Evelyn stayed seated, watching the ripples spread across the fountain's surface. The rain had left tiny rings in the water, each one disappearing into the next like all the moments of a life, separate yet connected. Above her, the young maple tree swayed, scattering droplets that sparkled briefly before falling into the earth. She closed her eyes and let the quiet settle. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. Not every ending is about parting. Some endings are simply pauses, spaces of stillness that remind us that kindness, even when it doesn't change the world, still matters. And as the city's light shimmered against the wet pavement, Evelyn Ross smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest form of courage isn't found in grand gestures or perfect closure. It's found in choosing to stay kind, to stay open, to stay even when it's raining. And somewhere beyond the mist and the glow of streetlights, the fountain's quiet song carried through the night, a reminder that love, in its gentlest form, never truly leaves. It simply remains in the hearts of the ones who stay. In the end, Michael and Evelyn's story isn't just about love, it's about transformation. It reminds us that power without compassion is hollow, and silence without truth is only fear in disguise. Both of them learned that real strength isn't found in control, but in the courage to be honest, to stay kind, even when the world misunderstands you. We live in a time where success often means moving faster, speaking louder, reaching higher. But sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is slow down, to listen, to care, to stand beside someone when it rains instead of waiting for the sun. Evelyn taught us that gentleness can disarm pride, and Michael showed that redemption is always possible when we choose humanity over ego. So, if you take one lesson from their journey, let it be. This kindness is not weakness. It is the quietest form of courage. And in a world that often forgets to pause, the ones who stay, who keep showing up with compassion, are the ones who truly change everything. Thank you for spending your time with us, and for letting this story touch your heart. If Michael and Evelyn's journey reminded you of the quiet power of kindness and courage, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing meaningful stories, stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the beauty still found in everyday humanity. Stay with us, because sometimes all it takes is one story to change the way we see the world.